Right, so Palestine have, as has been quite widely reported now, taken a seat at the United Nations General Assembly. Not as an observer state seated elsewhere, however, but seated amongst the other nations, which is a big step forward towards permanent member status, as it absolutely should have, in my view, but which to all intents and purposes continues to be blocked by the United States, who of course in turn set the foreign policy of a lot of other nations besides, it seems. But that isn't the big surprise for Israel, despite their disgust at this turn of events. While the State of Palestine does not have permanent member status as yet, and therefore cannot cast a vote on motion still, it does have new rights and privileges, and one of those is that they can now present draft resolutions to the General Assembly. This is something they have done now already, and unlike the news of their seat at the UNGA, it's gone appallingly underreported that they've done this. And you can probably imagine why it is, but that is going to be giving Israel and Netanyahu's awful hard-right coalition government a massive throbbing headache, because although it's a bit of a surprise, it's not a pleasant one for them. Right, so the State of Palestine has taken its seat amongst other United Nations member states in the UN Assembly Hall, a new consequence of that vote that was held back in May, where the UN General Assembly voted through the recognition that the State of Palestine met the criteria for becoming a full member state, and recommended to the UN Security Council to reconsider their decision to decline that more favourably, with the US having vetoed that move previously. They did, of course, then proceed to veto it again when it came back to them. Nonetheless, the passing of that resolution in May with regards to the State of Palestine by the UN General Assembly has awarded them new rights and privileges, and this includes now being seated where it belongs amongst those other member states in the Assembly Hall at the UN. So far, so much you may already know, may have already heard. However, amongst these new rights the State of Palestine has is the ability to, although it can't vote on it, bring draft resolutions to the UN General Assembly, and that is a big problem for Israel, because the very first draft resolution being brought by the newly seated State of Palestine drops a bombshell on them, something Israel have done too often to them, all too literally, but in this case it is a much more figurative bomb drop. You may recall back in July that the International Court of Justice ruled that the occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories was in their view illegal. The decision stated that Israeli forces in the territories were there illegally, that they should withdraw as soon as possible. An excerpt from Reuters from that time on the findings stated that Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law, President Nawaf Salam said, reading the findings of a 15-judge panel. The court said Israel's obligations include paying restitution for harm and the evacuation of all settlers from existing settlements. In a swift reaction, Israel's foreign ministry rejected the opinion as fundamentally wrong and one-sided, and repeated its stance that a political settlement in the region can only be reached by negotiations. Now that decision was all well and good, but it was not legally binding, it was advisory. Nonetheless, an advisory opinion from the ICJ, itself an organ within the United Nations, does carry a certain weight carried forward. And with this new position the State of Palestine now has within the UN, that is exactly what their resolution is all about. But not only that, the State of Palestine want to set a clock on it too. You see, the permanent mission to the UN acting on behalf of the State of Palestine is to next week present a draft resolution to the UN General Assembly demanding Israel end its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories entirely and do so within 12 months. The ICJ advisory opinion is a demonstration of the illegality of Israel's occupation now, which has of course been in place since 1967, and also includes decisions made by the UN Security Council, as well as others made by the ICJ, that Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territory do violate international law, and the resolution will also re-emphasise the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, something they haven't had now in something like 4 generations. In the words of the resolution itself, the draft resolution demands that Israel bring to an end without delay its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, which constitutes a wrongful act of a continuing character entailing its international responsibility, and to do so no later than 12 months from the adoption of the present resolution. It further demands Israel end its occupation in line with ICJ decisions and cease new settlement activities, withdraw from all settlements and compensate for the damage caused in the occupied Palestinian territories. Along with these demands, the resolution also turns to the matter of support for Israel, along with a swipe at the likes of the US, which, in line with UN member states' responsibility towards fulfilling in good faith the obligations they all have towards the state of Palestine as an observer member nation, none of them should be accepting the illegal situation Israel has created in Gaza, most notably of late. They should all be rejecting it. They should be avoiding the aiding of Israel in any way as a result of that, and they should be implementing the necessary sanctions against them. Without full accountability being extended to all member states equally, violations of international law cannot possibly be dealt with effectively. This is just common sense, surely. From the protection of civilians to ensuring justice is handled fairly to ensuring the promotion of peace and to deter future violations. So these points are also included in Palestine's resolution. And the resolution also requests that a conference under the terms of the Geneva Conventions on the Protection of Civilians in Wartime be held within the next 6 months, with a call to Switzerland to implement this, Switzerland's responsibility when anything comes to the Geneva Conventions, within this time frame, and also calls on the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to present a report on the implementation of the resolution within 3 months of its adoption. So to say the state of Palestine is not hanging around with exercising its newfound rights might be considered an understatement by some. But you have to understand, this is 57 years in the making now. 57 years of occupation they are seeking to end. So why should they wait any longer? Frankly, they cannot afford to wait, with more lives being lost daily, not just in Gaza, but the West Bank too. Should this pass, and it is still open to be changed, it will dump more pressure on Israel. It will shame them further, show them up on the world stage, though a UN General Assembly vote will still not be legally binding in and of itself either. Should it pass, however, and I think it will, that stage, and the vote is apparently coming next week, the UN General Assembly would, I think, then refer it to the UN Security Council for a legally binding decision. And I think at this point we can all guess where that would most likely end up. The US will almost certainly veto it. But this could be the most damaging veto they will ever render, if so, because by refuting the findings of the ICJ, their advisory opinion, and by this point the opinion of their fellow UN nations, any US claims to want to invest in a two-state solution, any US claims to want peace, will be laughed at to their faces. How can they possibly stand there and say they want peace or a two-state solution when one state illegally occupies the other, the World Court says it's illegal, and yet you still decide to unilaterally vote otherwise? If Israel itself wasn't deeply concerned at the prospect of this coming to a UN General Assembly vote as well, frankly I don't think they'd be squealing much about it either. But of course they are. The Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, has, for example, whinged to the General Assembly that they should reject this resolution by the state of Palestine, saying they should reject this disgraceful resolution outright and instead adopt a resolution condemning Hamas and calling for the immediate release of all hostages. Well, I guess you're free to bring such a resolution, aren't you, sunshine? Why don't you do that instead of wine? The office of Benjamin Netanyahu has trotted out that old line of the Jewish nation cannot be occupiers in its own land. But it isn't your land. Many Jews around the world, of course, condemn Israel for calling itself Jewish, for daring to do that, when it is a Zionist nation, far more accurately. Other Israeli ministers, particularly those close to the Israeli settler movement, have mouthed off as well about this, so it clearly bothers them, this resolution, and it should. Keep an eye out for this resolution passing at the UN General Assembly, at any rate, and what comes after that. We can't keep letting the mainstream media in the UK ignore matters like this when they are of such huge importance, and yet again, you'll have probably heard nothing about it unless you just happen to spot it somewhere on social media by accident. Well, this channel will be very much keeping an eye on it, though, and will no doubt have lots to say about it in due course. Meanwhile, of course, whilst the state of Palestine ready their resolution, Israel is saying they're prepared to turn Beirut into a war zone that looks like Gaza next, but we must never forget they're always the victims, aren't they, right? Get the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.